Hi all, I'm Ryan Stanton. Today I'm going to present my work on playfield podcasting. So, quick notes about me. My name is Ryan. I go by he, him pronouns. I completed my honours studying actual play podcasts, which are podcasts that are all about broadcasting tabletop game sessions as a serial story. I followed that up by starting a PhD on gaming podcasts more broadly, which I'm a bit under a year into. My discoveries so far form the basis of this presentation. So what are gaming podcasts? The definition I've been working under is any podcast which has games or game-related topics as their primary focus. Now that's a broad net I just cast, so it's important to provide a few clarifying notes to set the boundaries here. Firstly, when talking gaming podcasts, this includes games digital and otherwise, though it doesn't include traditional sports. The other thing to note is that traditionally we think of podcasts as audio, but they can also be video. There's a growing minority that you may see doubling as a live stream or vice versa. So, with those two things out of the way, why are gaming podcasts worth studying? Well, firstly, it's a big field, and it's a field that hasn't been studied. On Apple Podcasts alone, there are over 14,000 different gaming podcasts. But despite this, when they've been studied, it's always as an example of something else, studying them as fan culture podcasts, as opposed to gaming podcasts themselves. Podcasts more generally have also been attracting attention from a variety of interested parties in the media spheres, both old and new, particularly as they've been noted to reach an audience of people often thought of as unmarketables. The most important thing, though, is that gaming podcasts are at the unique intersection between two schools of new media content creation, podcasting and gaming content creation, respectively. But while this is a fascinating intersection, it's the type of thing which has often been understudied, particularly in game studies. The interdisciplinary nature here is, I think, important, and it might help bring game studies into starker contrast by comparing it to the fields that it neighbours in this intersection. So why is this intersection interesting? Well, I think there are three key similarities that highlight the potential overlap between these two fields that I think makes it worthy of analysis. They're both intrinsically tied to new media and wouldn't exist without it. Both have or have had the feeling of a Wild West frontier that anybody can get in on, and as a result have attracted creators from a variety of fields and industries. And then finally, they're both reliant on large platform holders like Apple or Spotify for podcasts and Amazon and Google for gaming content creation to function for the most part, which is a factor that creates an unequal power dynamic between creator and platform. So, hopefully I've established why this is an important topic to study, but I haven't established how we study them. The reality is that there's very little study of gaming podcasts that's been done so far, which is why I think it's important to start with this typology to help delineate and define the field. Now, what I'm going to present here is a work in progress. I want to stress that. But I think it's an important one that can help us understand how gaming podcasts might tie into the broader game studies field. So, how does this typology help define what gaming podcasts are? As we've seen, there's a great deal of variety in the field, and so we're going to be using two main axes here to help differentiate the types of podcasts you might encounter: the creator's background and the show genre or format. Both of these have been chosen as there are some clear patterns or categories that have emerged in my study around them, and I believe that they might be helpful guides when it comes to discussing gaming podcasts in the future, be that studying game podcasts themselves or as part of a different study. So, two quick things before we dive into these axes. I mentioned previously that gaming podcasts can exist on any platform, and that holds true here, even if some of these categories might seem like they are preferential to specific formats or platforms. Secondly, in the vein of flexibility, this typology should not be viewed as a rigid structure, but as a tool or a guide. The goal is to create a frame which can prompt further thinking and theory about gaming podcasts, not to box them into specific categories. As a result, it's important to be very clear from the start: the categories in this typology are not mutually exclusive. You can and will see podcasts which fit multiple categories. That's part of the design. So the first axis is create a background, which refers to any relevant background or cultural capital which might feed into the podcast or its promotion. This is not referring to specific aspects of demographic diversity, though that is an important thing to consider when analysing any of these podcasts. I've identified 6 categories here in my research. The first is audio creators, which is often those who have prior experience with podcasting, but can also be those with experience in radio, music, or, other audio formats. This is like the McElroy brothers, famous podcasters who have one of their later podcasts dedicated solely to video games in the Besties, or in their actual play podcast, The Adventure Zone. Then you have streamers as the second category, be they on Twitch or YouTube or other platforms. This category refers to people who have been streamers before becoming podcasters and often leverage the cultural capital acquired in the former into the latter. The next category is the rest of the people dedicated to gaming content creation. This might be Let's Players, modders, game critics and journalists, both past and present, or even game developers themselves. If they create a podcast where their talent or persona is a draw, it'll probably fit into this category. Then you have corporation-driven. This refers to any podcast which was created or commissioned by a specific business, corporation, or site. This is distinguished from the other gaming content creation podcasts in that more of the focus is placed on the brand of the podcast or associated brand, rather than the individual hosts or talent. Think Kotaku's podcast, Kotaku Split Screen, which has gone through 3 different hosting teams in as many years, but has kept the same name and brand. Following on from that, we have the hobbyist category. This is where you would place anybody who doesn't have any cultural capital in related fields to use in promotion of the podcast. That doesn't mean they're amateur or unsuccessful, just that they're starting from a different position. Finally, you have academic podcasts. This is a very small category at the moment, but it's an area that podcast studies likes to highlight as distinct, and hopefully we can grow it in future. It's basically anybody that's an academic talking about game studies. So when it comes to the format of the show, there are 5 main types that I've been able to define. The first is shows where a predominant focus is on the telling of a fictional narrative. Many of these shows are actual play shows, but there are a few exceptions, such as multiple seasons of a narrative show set in the Halo universe. Then you have niche-focused shows. This isn't shows that don't have a broad appeal, but rather shows that are explicitly centered on a specific niche for their format. So this could be very minute, such as specific genre, like a strategy game podcast 3 Moves Ahead, or it could be relatively broad, like any news related to Nintendo in the podcast, All Things Nintendo. From there, you have the more broad news or review style podcasts, which I've labeled as the cultural catch-up format. This is probably what many think of when they think of podcasts. It's a small group of people discussing a topic they share an interest in. A prime example is Waypoint Radio, the flagship of Vice Media's gaming coverage, which does news, reviews, and discussion of all the ongoing conversations in the game industry. After that, you have interview-focused podcasts. These focus on having a different guest in the games industry or surrounding industries being interviewed in each episode, sometimes by one host, sometimes by 2. It's pretty self-explanatory. Similarly, the documentary style is about what you'd expect, in the vein of an NPR, a 99% Invisible, or a serial-style podcast, but about games. One of the prime examples is an Australian podcast called Gameplay. Hopefully this typology has been helpful in teasing out some of the ways gaming podcasts are rooted in existing fields of gaming content creation and new media. I'd love to hear feedback on anything I can improve here, as it's early days, which brings me to the what's next of the matter. Hopefully using this framework, I can start to conduct some primary research, getting some case studies which represent the variety of categories outlined here, and then interviewing the creators and surveying the fans. The idea is that with this research, I can help highlight what is similar and different between these different types of podcasts, as well as how broader trends between them may align with or diverge from other new media industries. I hope to make this a priority over the course of the next year, so hopefully there'll be more to present in due time. But for now, I think it's important to just continue highlighting the importance of the field. It's one that hasn't been studied in depth, and I hope that maybe I've shed some light on how examining gaming podcasts can broaden the depth of game studies as a whole.